This series of videos is an introduction to working with Photoshop. Now, Photoshop, as you probably know, is Adobe's photo editing software. But Photoshop does way more than just photo editing. You can also use it for animation, video editing, digital painting, and graphic design. As we explore Photoshop, we're going to focus mostly on its photo editing and graphic design capabilities. Specifically for our first exercise, we are going to create this layout using a found photograph and some typography. But before we get there, I'd like to take a quick tour around the Photoshop interface. Now, to open up Photoshop, you just need to click on the icon that looks like this. Now, I already have Photoshop opened up here. If you're just opening up Photoshop, then the home screen will show up automatically. I'm just going to open up the home screen by coming to the Help drop-down menu and selecting Home. From this screen, we can choose to create a new document or open up a previously created one. Over here, you can see recently opened files. What I'd like you to do is create a new file by coming here and selecting Create New. Now, this new document window sort of highlights the different things that we can do here in Photoshop. Everything from photo to print, graphic design, art and illustration, digital painting, web design, mobile, and film and video. What I'd like you to do is come over here to Photo, and you can see that we have some preset documents at different sizes. If I scroll down though, I also want to show you that there are some free templates available to us through Adobe Stock. We're not going to worry about those right now, but I do recommend that you check out some of these items down here. What I'd like you to do is click on this preset document here, Landscape 5x7. That's 7 inches by 5 inches at 300 ppi. We'll talk about ppi in just a second. Once I've selected that, I'm going to click Create. Now you'll notice this looks very similar to what we've been working with in Illustrator. The interface can roughly be broken down into 5 general sections: the Artboard, the Toolbox, the panel stack, the drop-down menus across the top, and the contextually sensitive control panel that runs across here. Let's just go through these sections and see how they work. For the Artboard here, I've already set it up as a 5-inch by 7-inch document. But unlike Illustrator, the area outside of this document area is not available for us to place any imagery. If I zoom out here, you can see that this document is surrounded by a large area of black, and we can't place anything in there. I'm going to press Command 0 on my keyboard to bring that back into my field of view. The next section I want to look at is the Toolbox. The Toolbox looks very similar to the one in Illustrator. However, there are a couple of differences. One thing that is similar is the white triangle in the corner of these tool icons. When you see a white triangle, that means that there is a subset of tools that if I just click and hold on that tool, I can reveal. And again, like Illustrator, the top tools are mostly our selection tools. But the number of tools in our toolbox is way more than what we see here. In fact, Photoshop has one of the most extensive toolboxes in the entire Adobe Creative Suite. Let me show you where they are. Here, I have this icon that looks like 3 dots. That's an ellipsis that basically tells you that there's more to be had. If I just click and hold on that tool, you can see that, in fact, I have a number of other tools that are available to me here that are not currently being shown. We can always add one of these tools to our toolbox by coming up here to Edit Toolbar, and that brings up this Customize Toolbar window, which allows us to move some tools into our toolbox. For example, my selection tools across the top here don't currently include my elliptical marquee tool. Don't worry if you're not familiar with what that tool is. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But what I'd like to do is add this tool to my toolbox. I'm just going to click on it here in my Extra Tools window and drag it over to the left and drop it in like that. And you can see I now have that as one of my tools available in my toolbox. I'd also like to add my rectangular marquee tool to my toolbox, but I'd like the rectangular tool and the elliptical marquee tool to be in the same drop-down menu. So I'm just going to drag it over top of the elliptical marquee tool. Now you can see both of these are together in my toolbox. If I click and hold, both of those tools are now linked together. Now down at the bottom, we see these 2 color swatches. In Illustrator, these 2 color swatches represented the fill color and the stroke color of objects. In Photoshop, it works a little bit differently. The front color swatch represents what's called the foreground color, and the other color swatch is called the background color swatch. We'll see how we use these in just a bit. Let's talk about the panel stack on the right-hand side. Currently, what I'm seeing is a preset workspace created for a particular task. Let me show you what I mean. Right next to this icon above the panel stack is this drop-down arrow. I'm going to click on that once. And you can see some of the different workspaces that Photoshop has created for us. You may have the essentials showing right now. I've got graphic and web, and I'd like you to choose that as well. Once it's looking like this, we are going to make a couple of small changes. The first thing I want to do is take this panel, our layers panel, and drag it from this column over to the column just on the left. And you can see how that column lights up blue as I release over top of it. Now that layers panel is over here. I want to reveal the names of these panels, however. As I get familiar with Photoshop, I don't have to guess what these all refer to. I'm going to take my cursor and hover over the left of this panel stack and drag to the left so I can reveal those names. I can collapse any of these panels down into their icons just by clicking on these double-headed arrows on the tops of these panel stacks. In fact, I will collapse those panels. However, once I've made some changes to my workspace, I may want to save this. I'm going to come to the Window drop-down menu, and I'm going to come here to where it says Workspace, and I'm going to select New Workspace. And here I suggest you either put your name or your initials and the name of the workspace that you're going to be working in. I'm going to say Save. Now in the future, if I want to change my workspace to something else, I can always come back here to the Window drop-down menu or over here and select the previously created workspace. And of course, just like Illustrator, there are way more panels available to us than what we see here. If we want to open up any particular panel, we can always come up to the Window drop-down menu and select our panels from this list here. Which brings me to some of the other drop-down menus. These function similarly to Illustrator. Some of these drop-down menus we will use more than others. The drop-down menu that we will be using most, though, is this one here, the Image drop-down menu, and its Adjustments section, which allows us to do some really interesting photo editing. And finally, we have our Control panel, this panel that runs across the top of our Artboard. And just like in Illustrator, this is contextually sensitive, meaning that as I choose different tools from my toolbox here, the options will change across the top. Now, before we do anything else, I want to show you one more thing. Let's open up the Preferences panel in Photoshop. I'm going to click on the Photoshop name, and I can open up Preferences here and click on General. There aren't too many things I want to change here. If I click on Interface, there are some options here available for us to change things like the appearance of Photoshop. Currently, the interface is using this dark gray, but we could go darker still or lighter. Now, this is the way Adobe products used to look with this light gray color, but Adobe has gone to this darker gray interface because they've discovered that it actually reduces eye strain. I would keep it at least this dark. The only other thing, though, that I like to change is this highlight color. By default, the highlight color is a light gray. And let me show you what that looks like. If I come over here to the Layers panel and choose my layer, you can see that it is this light gray. Let me come back here to Preferences. I'm going to change that to blue and say OK. And now you can see that the highlight color is blue. This is how Illustrator displays its highlights. Now that we've taken a tour around the interface, let's do a small exercise. I want you to open up the Layers panel. And you'll notice that we have this one layer here called background. And that background layer has a little lock icon next to it here. As a general rule of thumb, I tend not to work on this background layer. If I'm going to be creating any imagery or shapes in Photoshop, I like to create them on a layer above this background layer. So let's do that first before we do anything else. I'm going to create a new layer by clicking on this icon here in the Layers panel to create a new layer. And you can see I now have something called Layer 1 above my background layer. With that layer selected, I'm going to come over to my toolbox and I'm going to click once on my rectangle marquee tool. And now, somewhere in my document, I'm just going to click and drag a rectangle. If I hold down my Shift button, I can constrain that shape to a perfect square. I now have made a selection. There's nothing in that selection just yet. What I'd like to do is fill this selection with a color. To do that, I'm going to come to the Edit drop-down menu and select Fill. From this dialog box, this top field here is asking me, how do I want to fill my selection? Content aware is a very interesting topic. We'll leave that for a later tutorial. If I click on the disclosure triangle, however, you can see that I have some options here. At the very top, I have something called the foreground color. Well, we saw this a little bit earlier in our toolbox. We have the foreground color right here. Currently, it's this royal blue. Yours is probably black. Whatever your foreground color is, I want you to click on that and say, OK. I've now created a shape on this new layer 1. Currently, you can still see that there's this dotted line around that shape. That is what's called the marquee. I can get rid of that by coming up here to the Select drop-down menu and choosing Deselect, or Command D on my keyboard. I now have this shape on that layer on its own. Now this shape is very similar to one that we would create in Illustrator. Let's create another shape here. I'm going to come back to my toolbox and I'm going to click and hold on the rectangular marquee tool, and this time I'm going to choose the elliptical marquee tool. And I'm going to click and drag with this tool right next to the square, and if I hold down my Shift button as I do so, I can constrain that shape to a perfect circle. I've now made a new selection. I'm going to fill this shape with a different color. I'm going to come over to my toolbox and I'm going to double click this foreground color swatch. This is called my color picker, the foreground color picker in particular. What I'd like you to do is choose a color along this hue slider here. In my case, I'm just going to choose this green and I'm going to say OK. I now have my new foreground color, and I'm going to fill this shape that I currently have selected by coming to the Edit drop-down menu and selecting Fill and choosing the foreground color and saying OK. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect this shape by coming here to the Select drop-down menu and selecting Deselect, or Command D on my keyboard. Now I have two shapes. However, unlike Illustrator, these two shapes exist on the same layer. I'm going to open up the Layers panel and you can see that yes, in fact, this new shape that I've created here is still on layer 1 with this blue shape. If we were back in Illustrator, I could use my Move tool, which is the equivalent to the black arrow in Illustrator, and I would be able to click on either one of these and move them individually. But in Photoshop, it doesn't work that way. In Photoshop, you can keep on adding elements to a single layer. The problem with that is when you want to edit those elements, it becomes difficult to select them if they are all on a single layer. That's why layer management in Photoshop is really important. What I should have done when I created this green circle was create a new layer first and work on that layer. But doing something like I've just done here in Photoshop, where I've put multiple elements on a single layer, happens all the time. So the last thing I want us to do is do a simple selection that allows us to take an item from one layer and move it to another layer. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to come back over to my toolbox and I'm going to click on this tool right here, the Quick Selection tool. And with the Quick Selection tool, I want to select this green circle here by clicking once on the green part. But now that I have that shape selected, I'm going to turn that selection into a new layer by coming to the Layers drop-down menu and selecting New Layer via Cut. What this will do is cut that shape from that layer and create a new one, as you can see here. If I come over to my Move tool, I can select these shapes individually. In our next video, we are going to create this layout.